That was the first thing Jonas Hale noticed when he crested the ridge and looked down at the land his father had left him. Not the frozen soil, not the crooked jack pines, not the wall of black rock rising against the mountain like a broken tooth. Steam, a slow, patient ribbon of it, curling up from somewhere near the base of the outcrop as if the earth itself were breathing in the cold November air. He might have thought nothing of it, a trick of the light. A patch of damp moss warmed by the last of the afternoon sun. But Jonas had spent enough winters in the high country of western Wyoming to know that nothing breathed like that when the temperature had already dropped below freezing. Nothing except a living thing, or the mountain itself. He would not understand what he was looking at, not truly, until 3 months later, when a blizzard buried half the county and 11 people crowded shoulder to shoulder inside walls that men in town had called a joke. But that was still to come. On that afternoon in late 1889, Jonas Hale only knew that he had $22 in his pocket, a wife and daughter waiting in a broken wagon behind him, a swayed-back mule named Rufus who had already gone lame once that week, and a scrap of paper claiming 40 acres of ground that everyone in Merton County agreed was worthless. The reading of his father's estate had taken less than an hour. Old Silas Hale had died in August of a fever that came on quick and stayed too long, and by the time the debts were counted against the property, there was little left worth arguing over. The timber house went to the bank. The barn went to the bank. The pasture along Willow Creek, the fenced acres, the water rights his father had fought a 2-year lawsuit to secure, all of it went to Ellsworth Grady, the cattleman who had been circling the Hale property like a patient hawk for the better part of a decade. Jonas received the 40 acres above Bear Tooth Ridge because no one else wanted them. He received the mule because no one else would take him. He received $22 in silver because that was what remained after the lawyer took his cut. His wife Martha did not weep in the bank office. She had already done her weeping in August, and again in September, and one more time on the morning they packed the wagon. She held their 8-year-old daughter Ada by the hand and watched Jonas fold the deed into his coat pocket. The brown shepherd Willow, who had followed Ada home from a neighbor's barn 2 winters back, and never once slept anywhere but at the foot of the child's bed, pressed against the girl's leg and watched the strangers in the office with quiet, careful eyes. Ellsworth Grady stood in the doorway of the bank as they came out onto the boardwalk. He was chewing the wet end of a small cigar, and he smiled the way a man smiles when a bet is paid off exactly the way he expected it to. "That parcel up on the ridge, Hale," he said, loud enough for the men at the Mercantile to hear. "Ground's frozen half the year, other half it's mud and shale. You couldn't grow a turnip up there with a prayer and a plow horse. Won't even bury a man proper. Dirt's too hard to dig past October." 2 of the men on the Mercantile porch laughed. A third looked away. "Come back when you're done being proud," Grady called after them. "There's a bunkhouse on the old place, cots already made." Jonas did not answer. He handed Martha up to the wagon seat, lifted Ada in beside her, and clicked the reins. Rufus leaned into the harness with the resigned patience of an animal who had been asked too many times to do too much. The wagon rolled north out of Merton under a low gray sky that smelled of coming snow. It was 2 days on the trail before they reached the parcel. 2 days of frozen creek crossings and axle repairs, and Martha holding Ada tight against the cold beneath a thin wool blanket. 2 days for Jonas to turn the same question over in his mind, again and again. How does a man build a house before winter with $22 and know what he does not cut himself? He was still turning that question when they crested the ridge on the second afternoon, and he saw the steam. He climbed down from the wagon slowly, told Martha to wait, and walked out across the frozen ground toward the black outcrop. The steam did not shift with the wind. It rose in a steady column, as if something below the stone were exhaling in slow, even breaths. Jonas knelt beside a shallow basin worn into the rock, pulled off his glove, and reached out. The water was warm. Not warm the way sun-heated stone is warm. Warm the way bath water is warm on a Saturday night in a kitchen with a stove going. He pulled his hand back and stared at his fingers as though they belonged to someone else. Then he lowered his palm again, held it there against the smooth basin floor, and felt the heat travel up his wrist and into his arm. Behind him, small boots crunched on the frost. Ada had crept up beside him with Willow at her heel. "Papa," she whispered, "why is the ground warm?" Jonas did not answer for a long time. Somewhere behind his eyes, the shape of a house was already beginning to form, not the kind of house any man in Merton County would recognize, but a house built around a thing the mountain itself was giving him for free. He just did not yet know how much the town would laugh when they heard about it. They spent that first night in the wagon, drawn up as close to the black outcrop as Rufus would tolerate. Jonas built a small fire in the lee of the rock, and Martha heated water for coffee in a battered tin pot. Ada fell asleep with her head against her mother's shoulder, and Willow curled tight against the child's boots. The wind came down off Beartooth Ridge sometime after midnight and moaned through the jack pines, but the strange steam kept rising from the basin at the base of the stone, patient and unbothered, as though the mountain had been breathing that way for 1,000 years and had no intention of stopping now. Jonas did not sleep. He sat with his back against the wagon wheel and watched the steam curl upward against the black sky, and he thought about walls. A man with money built walls out of milled lumber. A man with time built them out of hewn logs. A man with neither had to find something else, and Jonas had been on the trail long enough to know that the jack pines on the southern slope would not give him more than a few thin poles. There was no good timber on this parcel. There was shale and clay and stone, and a warm spring rising out of the rock. By first light, he was walking the boundary lines with his father's old ledger tucked under one arm. Silas Hale had kept careful notes for 30 years: rainfall, first frost, calving weights, the depth of the snowpack in every winter since 1859. Jonas turned the pages as he walked, not because he expected to find an answer written there, but because the handwriting steadied him. His father had been a man who watched the country closely before he ever spent $1 on it. Jonas meant to do the same. He measured the outcrop first. The black wall of stone ran roughly 40 feet along a north-south line, and it rose in places to the height of a 2-story barn. At its base, 3 separate seeps of warm water gathered into a shallow basin no wider than a wagon bed. The largest of them steamed strongest. Jonas laid his palm flat against the rock a foot above the water and held it there. The stone itself was warm. That was the piece he had not understood the night before. The spring was not simply water rising warm from below. The whole face of the outcrop, along a stretch of maybe 15 feet, held heat like a stove that had been fired the day before and not yet cooled. Somewhere behind that wall of rock, deep in the body of the mountain, a fault line or a vein of thermal water was pressing its warmth outward through the stone. Jonas stood back and looked at the outcrop for a long time. Then he began to draw in the frost with the toe of his boot. Martha found him there an hour later, crouched down and sketching lines into the thin crust of ice. She did not ask what he was doing. She only stood at his shoulder and waited. Ada came up behind her mother with Willow padding alongside, and the child bent to study the shapes her father had drawn on the ground. "That's the rock," Ada said, pointing. "And that's a house." "It's a house with one wall already built," Jonas said. Martha understood then. She looked up at the black outcrop and at the steam still rising from the basin and back down at the lines her husband had scratched into the frost. A cabin built against the warm stone. A cabin that would use the outcrop itself as its north wall, letting the mountain's heat bleed into the room through the night. A cabin that would sit directly over the smallest of the 3 seeps, drawing steam up through the floorboards on the coldest days. "Jonas," she said carefully, "will the water rot the timbers?" It was the right question. It was the question he had been sitting with since midnight. "Not if the floor sits high enough above the seep," he said. "Not if we channel it out through a stone drain. Not if we let the steam rise but keep the water moving." He looked up at her. "My father built a smokehouse once with a river stone floor, 20 years, and it never rotted. Stone doesn't rot, Martha. Timber rots because it sits in wet without air moving past it. If I build this right, the air will move." She was quiet for a long moment. She was not a woman who agreed easily, and Jonas loved her for it. "And the walls?" she asked at last. "Stone at the base," he said. "4 courses high, mortared with clay, then timber above, chinked with clay and moss. The roof low and pitch steep for snow. A stove in the corner for cooking, but the room itself heated by the outcrop." He paused. "We won't need much fuel, Martha, not if I do this right. That's the thing nobody in Merton would understand. We won't need much fuel at all." Martha looked at the steam rising in the cold morning air. Then she looked at their daughter, whose cheeks were already reddened from the wind. She looked at Willow, whose breath came out in short white clouds. She looked at the shallow basin of warm water at the base of the black rock, and at the mule standing patient in the harness, and at the wagon with its cracked wheel and its 3 tiers in the canvas cover. "Then we had better start today," she said. The first week was stone. Jonas rose before light each morning and worked until his hands could no longer close around the handle of the pry bar. The shale that covered most of the parcel turned out to be a gift in disguise. It broke away from the ground in flat, heavy plates, some no thicker than a book, others as broad as a wagon seat. He hauled them one at a time in a canvas sling, laying them out in careful rows near the base of the outcrop, sorting them by size the way another man might sort coins. Martha worked beside him when Ada could be trusted to mind the fire, and Ada worked beside him when Martha could not. The child was small for 8, but she was steady, and she learned quickly that a stone laid crooked one morning meant a stone reset the next. Willow appointed herself the family's overseer, trotting the perimeter of the growing foundation with the grave attention of a dog who understood that something important was being built and meant to be present for all of it. By the end of the 5th day, Jonas had traced the outline of his cabin into the frozen ground with a trench 2 hands deep, 14 feet along the outcrop, 16 feet outward from the stone, smaller than the parlor of his father's old house. But the north wall was already built. It had been built by the mountain, 40 feet high and warm to the touch, and Jonas meant to press his little house against it like a child pressing against the belly of a sleeping horse. The trench itself was the part that would have puzzled anyone watching. Jonas dug it deeper along the line where the smallest of the 3 seeps rose from the rock, and he lined that deeper channel with the flattest stones he could find, fitting them together edge to edge with the patience of a man setting a mosaic. He was building a drain. The warm water would rise from the seep, spread beneath the floor of the cabin, and exit through the stone channel out the southern wall, where it would run away downslope through a second trench packed with river gravel. The water would move. The air beneath the floor would move with it. Nothing would sit still long enough to rot. Above the drain, he raised the foundation courses. He did it the way his grandfather had done it in Vermont 60 years before, dry laid at the bottom, then bedded in a mortar of clay and sand, and the fine ash Martha saved from every fire. He worked the mortar into the joints with his fingers and smoothed it flat with a piece of broken shingle. Each course of stone tied into the outcrop itself, wedged tight against the black rock, so that the mountain became part of the wall and the wall became part of the mountain. On the 9th day, the first snow came. It arrived at mid-afternoon, small dry flakes at first, then heavier, until the parcel was hidden beneath a soft gray curtain. Jonas kept working. He had 2 courses of stone still to lay before the timber frame could go up, and he knew what any Wyoming winter did to a man who let himself fall behind schedule. Martha brought him coffee at intervals, and Ada carried small stones from the sorting pile to save her father the trips, and Willow lay flat in the snow beside the growing wall and watched them all with unblinking patience. That was the afternoon a rider came up the trail from the south. Jonas heard him before he saw him, the slow, familiar clop of a shod horse picking its way through fresh snow. He straightened, wiped his hands on his coat, and turned to face the trail. A tall figure in a heavy buffalo coat rode into view around the shoulder of the ridge and drew rein at the edge of the parcel. It was Cyrus Doone, the freight hauler who ran the road between Merton and the mining camps up in the Absarokas. Jonas had known him since boyhood. Cyrus was a man who spoke little and noticed everything, and he was also, unfortunately, a man who could not keep a story to himself once he was back in a warm saloon. He sat his horse for a long moment and looked at what Jonas had done. He looked at the trench cut into frozen ground. He looked at the two courses of stone rising against the black outcrop. He looked at the shallow basin of warm water still steaming at the base of the rock, and at the small drain channel Jonas had built to carry that water away beneath the floor of a house that did not yet exist. Then he leaned forward on the pommel of his saddle and squinted, as though he could not quite believe what he was seeing. "Jonas Hale," he said slowly, "are you fixing to build a house on top of a boiling puddle?" Jonas set down his pry bar. He walked out to the edge of the trail and stood beside Cyrus's horse, and he answered the question honestly, because it was the only kind of answer he knew how to give. "I am," he said. Cyrus sat very still. He looked past Jonas at Martha, who had come to the doorway of the wagon with Ada tucked against her hip. He looked at the mule standing swayed back and patient in the harness. He looked at the small, careful stone drain and at the steam rising in the cold air, and then he looked back at Jonas, and Jonas could see the story already forming behind the freight hauler's eyes. "Well," Cyrus said at last. He tipped his hat back on his head. "Well, Jonas, I reckon I'd best not keep you from your work." He clicked to his horse and moved on up the trail toward the mining camps, and Jonas stood in the snow and watched him go. And he knew, as surely as he knew the shape of his own hands, that by the time Cyrus Doone came back down the pass on his return trip, every man in Merton County would have heard about the fool on Bear Tooth Ridge who was building his cabin on top of a hot puddle. Cyrus Doone came down off the pass on a Thursday, and by Saturday night the story was in every saloon within 30 miles. Jonas heard the first version of it from a sheepherder named Elias Polk, who rode up the trail on the following Monday morning with a wagon load of cull lumber he was hauling from a played-out mining claim. Elias was a small, weathered man with a permanent squint and a habit of speaking as though every word cost him money. He drew rein at the edge of the parcel, looked at the half-built cabin, and delivered his news in 3 short sentences. "Heard about your spring," he said. "Doone told it in Merton. They're calling it the Fool's Kettle." Jonas thanked him for the news and asked what he wanted for the lumber. Elias named a price that was too low, and Jonas paid him in silver from the dwindling $22, and the sheepherder unloaded 11 rough boards and a bundle of split cedar shakes before he clicked his teeth at his horse and rode on without another word. The Fool's Kettle. Jonas turned the phrase over in his mind as he carried the boards, one at a time, to the growing frame of his house. He was not surprised. He had known the moment Cyrus rode away that the story would take on a shape of its own, and the shape it had taken was not the worst he could have imagined. A fool was a man who could be laughed at. A fool was not a man who was watched too closely. A fool was left alone to fail on his own terms, and Jonas needed to be left alone. By the middle of the 3rd week, the 4 courses of stone were laid, and the timber frame stood above them. He had hewn the corner posts himself from the tallest of the jack pines on the southern slope, and he had set them into notched sockets cut directly into the top course of stone. The frame was not large. A grown man could touch the ridgepole with an outstretched hand if he stood on a stool. But it was tight, and it was square, and it was pressed hard against the black outcrop so that when Jonas stood inside the unfinished walls and laid his palm against the north face, he could feel the mountain's warmth passing straight through the stone into the room. The roof went on in the 4th week. He pitched it steep, steeper than any roof he had ever built before, because he had read his father's ledger closely, and he knew what a Wyoming snowpack could do to a flat span. He laid the rafters close together and covered them with the cedar shakes Elias had sold him, and where the shakes did not quite meet the outcrop, he packed the gap with clay and moss and a strip of tarred canvas he had cut from the wagon cover. The floor came last, and the floor was where the real work lived. Jonas laid it 8 inches above the shallow basin of the warm seep, resting the joists on stone piers he had shaped by hand from the flattest shale plates. Between the joists, the warm water moved slowly through its channel of fitted stone, rising as steam through narrow gaps he had left between the floorboards near the north wall, and exiting through the drain that ran out beneath the southern sill. When he stood inside the finished cabin for the first time on a cold afternoon in early December, the air near the floor was warm without a fire ever having been lit. Martha came in behind him. She stood in the middle of the small room and turned slowly in a circle. Then she knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the floorboards. She looked up at him and her eyes were bright. "Jonas," she said, "it's warm." He nodded. He did not trust his voice. Ada came in next with Willow at her heel, and the child did what a child does. She lay down flat on the floor with her cheek pressed against the wood, and she closed her eyes and she smiled. Willow circled the room twice, sniffing at every corner, and then settled herself directly over the widest gap between the boards near the north wall, where the warm steam rose most steadily. The shepherd let out a long, satisfied sigh and did not move again for the better part of an hour. That evening, Jonas lit the small iron stove Martha had brought from her mother's kitchen, a stove no bigger than a nail keg, meant only for cooking. He fed it 3 small pieces of jack pine, and he closed the damper down to a whisper. The cabin warmed further, but only by a few degrees. The bulk of the heat was already there, radiating quietly from the black outcrop and rising in slow currents from the floor. He hung his father's cracked thermometer beside the door. The reading outside was 9 degrees above zero. The reading inside was 54. He wrote both numbers into the ledger. Below the numbers, he added a single line: fuel used, 3 sticks of jack pine, approximately 2 pounds. 2 pounds. In the old timber house down in Merton, his father had burned through 30 pounds of wood on a night this cold, and the parlor had still felt drafty by morning. Jonas closed the ledger and set it on the shelf he had built above the doorway, and he stood for a long moment looking at the small room he had made, a room that shared one wall with a mountain, and one floor with a spring, and one roof with a sky that was already darkening toward its second snow. He did not smile. He had not smiled much since August. But something in his chest loosened for the first time since he had signed the papers in the banker's office, and he stood there in the doorway of his cabin and let it loosen. Outside, the wind was picking up off Beartooth Ridge. Inside, Willow was already asleep on the warm floor, and Ada was setting the table for supper, and Martha was humming, very quietly, a hymn her mother had taught her 30 years ago in a farmhouse kitchen 1,000 miles east. The Fool's Kettle. Jonas turned the phrase over one more time and let it go. Let them laugh, he thought. Let them laugh all the way through Christmas. He had a feeling the laughing would stop before spring. The first visitor of the new cabin came on a Tuesday in the middle of December, and he did not come to laugh. His name was Henry Two Hawks, and he was a Shoshone rancher who ran a small string of hardy mountain cattle in the valleys east of Beartooth Ridge. Jonas had known him distantly for years. The two men had traded work at branding time when Jonas was still a boy on his father's place, but they had never been close, and Jonas was surprised to see him ride up the trail on the short, thick-coated pony he favored in winter. Henry drew rein at the edge of the parcel and sat for a long moment looking at the cabin. He looked at the way it pressed against the black outcrop. He looked at the low pitch of the drain running out from under the southern sill, where a thin ribbon of warm water disappeared into a bed of river gravel and steamed briefly in the cold air. He looked at the roof, and at the small stovepipe rising from it, and at the tracks of a shepherd dog running in careful circles around the perimeter. Then he swung down from the pony without waiting to be invited, and he walked over to the north face of the outcrop, and he laid his bare hand flat against the stone. He held it there for a long time. When he took it away, he turned to Jonas and spoke for the first time. "My grandmother's people knew this rock," he said. His voice was quiet and without hurry. "There is a place 3 days' ride north of here where the same warmth comes out of the ground. They wintered there when the game moved down out of the high country. They said the mountain was giving them its breath." Jonas did not know what to say. He nodded. "You built well," Henry said. He looked at the cabin again, at the tight seams and the steep roof and the careful stone drain. "But you have a problem you have not seen yet." Jonas felt something tighten in his chest. "What problem?" Henry walked to the shallow basin at the base of the outcrop and crouched down beside it. He dipped 2 fingers into the warm water and rubbed them together, and he brought his hand up to his nose and sniffed. Then he shook his head slowly. "The water is good," he said. "It will not poison you, but look." He pointed at a rim of pale yellow crust that had formed around the edge of the basin. "The mountain leaves a skin behind. Every day a little. In a year and 2 years this crust will close the seep. In 5 years the water will find a new way out, maybe here, maybe somewhere else. You must keep the channel open. Every week scrape it clean. Every month dig down and check the drain. If the water stops moving, the wood beneath your floor will begin to rot, and you will not know it until the floor gives way beneath your child." Jonas felt the cold move through him, not the cold of the Wyoming winter, but a colder thing, the cold of a man who has just been shown a failure he did not see coming. "How do you know this?" he asked. Henry stood. He wiped his fingers on his trousers. "My grandmother's people wintered at their warm place for 3 generations, he said. In the 4th generation the seep closed. They did not know why. They did not have the men who watched the rock closely enough. When the water stopped, the lodge floor rotted and a child fell through and drowned in the pool that had gathered beneath. After that they knew, they passed it down." He paused. "I am telling you because you built well, and it would be a waste for a well-built house to kill your daughter." Jonas stood very still. He looked at the basin and at the pale crust along its rim and at the small drain channel he had been so proud of 2 weeks before. "How often?" he asked. His voice was tight. "Every week a scraping, every month a deep cleaning, every spring before the thaw take up the floorboards and inspect the joists. If you see the wood darkening, replace it before summer. Do not wait." Henry looked at him steadily. "The mountain is generous, but it does not care whether you live or die. That part is your work." Jonas nodded. He held out his hand. Henry took it. His grip was dry and firm and brief. "You will have visitors this winter," the Shoshone rancher said. "Not because they wish you well, because they wish to see the thing they have heard about. Some will come to laugh. Some will come to steal the idea. 1 or 2 will come to help. You will not know which is which until they are already sitting at your table. Feed them anyway. In this country, a stove and a bowl of stew are worth more than a locked door." Then he mounted his pony and rode back the way he had come, and Jonas stood at the edge of the parcel for a long time after he was gone, thinking about crusted rims and rotting joists and children falling through floors. That night, he told Martha everything Henry had said. She listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she went to the shelf above the doorway and took down his father's ledger, and she turned to a fresh page, and she wrote across the top in her careful, upright hand, "Weekly, scrape the basin. Monthly, clean the drain. Spring, inspect the joists." She closed the book and set it back on the shelf. "We will keep the water moving," she said. Jonas nodded. He looked at his daughter, who was already asleep on the warm floor with Willow curled tight against her back. He looked at the black outcrop rising behind the north wall of his house. He thought about a Shoshone child, 4 generations ago, falling through the floor of a lodge into a pool that no one had known was gathering beneath. He did not sleep well that night. But in the morning, he took a flat piece of shale and a small iron scraper, and he knelt beside the basin at the base of the outcrop, and he began to clear the pale crust from the rim. It came away easily. He scraped every inch of the basin's edge, and he flushed the loose flakes down through the drain with a bucket of snowmelt, and he watched the warm water run clear and steady out through the stone channel beneath the southern sill. Then he stood up, and he wrote the date at the top of the new page in his ledger, and he made his first entry in a column that he would keep unbroken for the next 31 years of his life. The second visitor came on Christmas Eve, and he did come to laugh. His name was Bertram Pell, and he was the eldest son of the largest sheep operation on the eastern slope of the ridge. Bertram was 26 years old, well-fed, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes to a young man who has never yet been told no by anyone that mattered. He rode up the trail on a tall bay gelding at mid-afternoon, with a friend named Whit Corley riding a step behind him, and the two of them drew rein at the edge of the parcel without dismounting. Jonas was outside, splitting a small pile of jack pine into stove lengths. He straightened when he heard the horses, wiped his hands on his coat, and waited. Bertram Pell looked at the cabin for a long moment. Then he looked at his friend. Then he looked back at the cabin and he began to smile. "Well, Whit," he said, loud enough for Jonas to hear clearly. "There she is, the fool's kettle." Whit Corley laughed. He was a thin, freckled young man who laughed easily when Bertram did. Bertram nudged his horse forward a few steps. He did not dismount. He looked down at Jonas from the saddle with the lazy amusement of a man visiting a carnival. "Hale," he said, "I heard the story in Merton and I told my father it couldn't be true. A man doesn't build a house on top of a hot puddle. A man doesn't put his wife and daughter to sleep on wet ground and call it engineering. But here you are." He gestured at the cabin with one gloved hand. "Here you are doing exactly that." Jonas set down his splitting maul. He said nothing. "Tell me something," Bertram went on. "When the ground shifts in the spring, and it will shift, Hale, that's what wet ground does, where do you plan to move the child? Do you have a second cabin somewhere I don't see? Or do you plan to just watch her sink?" Whit laughed again. Jonas walked slowly to the edge of the parcel until he was standing directly beside Bertram's stirrup. He looked up at the young man and he spoke quietly without heat. "You are welcome to step down and come inside," he said. "You can put your hand on the north wall and feel what it does. You can look at the drain I built beneath the floor. You can look at the ledger where I record the temperature every morning and every evening. If you look and you still think what you think, I will not argue with you. But you will look first, or you will ride on. I do not have time to stand in the cold and be lectured by a man who has not yet dismounted." Bertram's smile faltered. It was a small thing, a tightening at the corner of the mouth, a shift in the eyes, but Jonas saw it, and he understood in that moment something he had not fully understood before, that Bertram Pell had not expected to be answered. He had expected the ordinary response of a poor man to a rich one. The lowered eyes, the shuffled feet, the mumbled defense. When Jonas offered none of these, the shape of the conversation changed, and Bertram did not know quite what to do with it. Whit Corley stopped laughing. There was a long silence. Somewhere behind the cabin, Willow began to bark, one sharp, questioning sound, and then another. Bertram recovered his smile. It came back a little thinner than before. "I don't need to look inside a fool's cabin to know what a fool has built," he said. He touched his hat brim in a mocking half-salute. "Merry Christmas to you, Hale. Give my regards to your wife. Tell her she has my sympathy." He turned his horse. Whit turned with him. The two of them rode back down the trail at an easy trot, and Jonas stood at the edge of the parcel and watched them go, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not anger, not quite. Something colder and steadier than anger. The feeling of a man who has just been reminded exactly why he is doing what he is doing. He went back to his splitting. That night, the family kept Christmas in the way of people who have almost nothing and are grateful for what they do have. Martha had saved a small piece of salt pork for months, and she cooked it slowly on the little iron stove with dried apples, and a handful of onions from a sack Elias Polk had sold them in November. Ada set the table with the careful ceremony of a child who understood that ceremony mattered more when there was little else. Willow, who had been given a scrap of the pork rind, ate it in 3 bites and then lay down on the warm floor to consider her good fortune. Jonas read aloud from the family Bible after supper, the passage about the shepherds in the field, because it was the passage his father had always read on Christmas Eve. Martha listened with her hands folded in her lap. Ada leaned against her mother and watched the small flame in the stove and did not fidget. When he closed the book, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Ada said, very quietly, "Papa, is Uncle Silas in heaven?" Jonas had not been called uncle by anyone in years, and it took him a moment to understand that she meant his father, her grandfather, who had died in August, and whom she had loved with the particular fierceness of a child for a grandparent who had never once told her she was too small or too loud. "Yes," he said, "I believe he is." "Can he see the house?" Jonas thought about that for a long time. "I hope he can," he said at last. "I think he would be surprised by it. But I think he would understand it. He was a man who watched the country closely before he ever spent $1 on it. I have tried to do the same." Ada nodded gravely as though this was the answer she had expected. Then she leaned her head against her mother's shoulder and closed her eyes, and within a few minutes she was asleep. Martha looked at Jonas across the small room. "Bertram Pell will not be the last," she said quietly. "No," Jonas said, "he will not. Are you afraid?" Jonas considered the question honestly. He looked at the black outcrop pressing warm against the north wall of his house. He looked at his father's ledger on the shelf above the doorway. He looked at his sleeping daughter and the shepherd curled at her feet. "Not of them," he said. He did not say what he was afraid of. He did not need to. Martha had lived with him long enough to know that a man like Jonas Hale was not afraid of the Bertram Pells of the world. He was afraid of the mountain closing its seep in the middle of a February night. He was afraid of a joist rotting quietly beneath a floorboard while his daughter slept above it. He was afraid, above all, of building something well and still not building it well enough. She reached across the table and took his hand. "We will keep the water moving," she said again. Outside, the wind was rising off Beartooth Ridge, and the first real snow of the deep winter was beginning to fall. January came in hard. The first week brought a snowfall that lasted 3 days without pause, and by the time the sky cleared, the drifts along the northern edge of the parcel were higher than Rufus's back. Jonas dug a path from the door of the cabin to the small lean-to he had built against the outcrop for the mule, and he dug it again the next morning when the wind had filled it in overnight. The shovel handle wore a permanent groove into his glove. Inside the cabin, however, the temperature held. He kept his father's ledger open on the shelf above the doorway and made his entries twice a day without fail. On the coldest morning of that first week, a morning when the thermometer beside the door read 17 degrees below zero, the reading inside the cabin was 51. He had burned 4 small sticks of jack pine in the little iron stove between suppertime and dawn. 4 sticks. In the old timber house down in Merton, his father would have burned an armload. Martha noticed the fuel pile before Jonas did. She had been keeping the count quietly in the back of her mind. On the 10th day of January, she stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at the neat stack of split jack pine against the outer wall, and she said, without turning around, "Jonas, come see this." He came and stood beside her. The pile was almost exactly the size it had been on Christmas Eve. In 3 weeks of winter, they had burned less wood than his father would have burned in 3 days. Martha did not say anything more. She only looked at him, and Jonas understood what her look meant. The fool's kettle was doing exactly what he had said it would do. The third visitor came on the 12th of January. She rode up the trail alone, on a small gray mare that picked its way carefully through the drifts, and she was the last person Jonas would have expected to see. Her name was Esther Grady, and she was the wife of Ellsworth Grady, the cattleman who had taken his father's homestead. Jonas stepped out of the cabin with his coat half-buttoned and stopped in the doorway when he saw who was on the trail. Esther Grady drew rein at the edge of the parcel. She was a small woman in her middle 50s, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak that had once been fine and was now beginning to show its years. Her face was thin and pale. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I have come to ask you a question, and I would be grateful if you would answer it plainly." Jonas nodded slowly and gestured toward the cabin. "Will you come inside, ma'am? It's warmer than the trail." She hesitated. Then she swung down from the mare a little stiffly and tied the horse to the post beside the lean-to. She followed him to the door and stepped inside. She stopped just past the threshold. She stood very still. Jonas watched her face. He had seen this expression before on Henry II Hawks and on Martha the first time she had knelt down and pressed her palm against the warm floor. It was the expression of a person whose ordinary understanding of the world had just been quietly rearranged. Esther Grady looked at the north wall. She looked at the small iron stove burning its whisper of a fire. She looked at the ledger open on the shelf above the doorway. She looked at Ada, who was sitting cross-legged on the warm floor with Willow's head in her lap. Then Esther Grady looked at Jonas, and her eyes were wet. "My husband," she said, very quietly, "burned 30 pounds of coal last night and could not keep our bedroom above 40 degrees. He is 63 years old, Mr. Hale, and his lungs are not what they were. The doctor in Merton has told me that if this winter runs as cold as the last one, he will not see spring." Jonas said nothing. "I did not come for charity," Esther Grady said. "I came to ask whether a man with money can build such a room onto an existing house before the deep cold comes. I need to know whether my husband can be warm this winter." Jonas was quiet for a long time. Then he turned to the shelf above the doorway, took down his father's ledger and reached for the stub of pencil. "Sit down, Mrs. Grady. I will draw you what I built." He drew for the better part of an hour. He showed her first the principle of the double wall, an inner course of tight-fitted planks set 2 hands away from the outer wall of the house, with the space between them packed with dry sawdust and wood ash and chopped straw. He explained that still air was the thing that held warmth, and that a wall trapping a layer of still air between 2 surfaces would do more work than a wall 3 times its thickness that let the air move. He showed her, second, the value of a heavy hearthstone. A stove on bare boards sent half its heat down into the floor and lost it. A stove on a wide, flat stone, reaching 2 feet on every side and rising 4 inches above the floorboards, would hold that heat like a warming pan and give it back slowly through the night. He showed her, third, the trick of the low ceiling. A cold room with a high ceiling would send its warmth up to the rafters. A room with a canvas stretched taut across the joists would keep the warm air close to the people who needed it. Esther Grady wrote nothing down. She only watched his hand and listened, and when he finished each explanation she nodded once, slowly, as though fitting each piece into a plan she was building in her own mind. When Jonas set down the pencil at last, she was quiet for a long moment. "How much would it cost, Mr. Hale, to hire the labor to do these things?" "Honest labor paid fair. For a room the size of your bedroom," he said, "with 2 men working 4 days, the lumber, the sawdust and ash for packing, a hearthstone shaped and set, and a proper canvas ceiling, $60, ma'am. Your husband would be warm through February." Esther Grady reached into a small leather purse at her belt and drew out a folded sheaf of bills. She counted out $60 and laid it on the table between them. Jonas looked at the money. He did not touch it. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I gave you the drawing as a neighbor, not for pay." "I am not paying you for the drawing," Esther Grady said. "I am hiring you to come and do the work, you and 1 other man of your choosing, 4 days beginning Monday. My husband does not yet know I have come here. When I tell him, he will refuse. And I will remind him that I signed the note on the north pasture last spring, and that I am entitled to spend $60 of household money as I see fit. On the 3rd day, when he can feel the warmth in the room, he will not be angry anymore." Jonas stared at her. Martha had come to stand beside his chair. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Jonas," she said quietly, "take the work." He looked at his wife. He looked at Esther Grady. He looked at the $60 on the table. He thought about pride, and about all the ways pride could kill a family in a winter like this one. He thought about Ada, who would need shoes in the spring. Then he thought about a 63-year-old man in a cold bedroom, and a wife who had ridden alone across the snow to ask a plain question of a man her husband had wronged. Jonas reached out and took the money. "Mrs. Grady," he said, "I will be at your gate at 7 o'clock Monday morning with 1 good man and enough tools to do the job right." Esther Grady stood up. She smoothed her cloak. She looked once more at the warm room and at the child on the floor and at the shepherd asleep with her head across the child's knee. "Mr. Hale," she said, "when I was a young woman my mother told me that a house is only a house until someone has slept warm in it on a night that would have killed them. After that it is something more." Then she was gone. Martha took the money and folded it into the tin box on the shelf. "Who will you take with you?" she asked. "Cyrus Doone." Martha raised an eyebrow. "The man who told the story in Merton." "The same. If he sees a warm room save a dying old man, he will tell that story too. I would rather have Cyrus telling both halves than only the first." The 4 days of work at the Grady house passed the way Jonas had hoped they would. Cyrus Doone met him at the gate on Monday morning with his tools tied in a canvas roll and his face carefully blank. He did not mention the story he had told in Merton. Jonas did not mention it either. The 2 men shook hands and went inside, and Ellsworth Grady met them in the parlor with the stiffness of a man who had lost an argument with his wife. He did not speak to Jonas on the first day. On the second, He stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched the two men pack the double wall with sawdust and ash, and he asked one short technical question about the placement of the hearthstone. Jonas answered it plainly. Ellsworth nodded once and walked away. On the fourth day, the work was finished. Jonas lit the small stove and fed it 3 careful sticks of pine. Cyrus stretched the canvas ceiling tight across the joists. The two men stood in the doorway and watched the room warm, and after 20 minutes the temperature had risen from 38 degrees to 61, and it stayed there. Ellsworth Grady came into the room at supper time. He stood in the middle of it for a long moment. He did not touch the walls. He only stood there, an old cattleman in a heavy wool coat, and he breathed the warm air in and out through his damaged lungs. Then he turned to Jonas. "Hale," he said, his voice rough. "I owe you an apology, and I am not going to give you one because a man my age does not know how to give an apology and mean it. But I owe you my winter, and a winter is not a thing that can be paid for, so I will say this instead. Any man who comes to my property looking to make trouble for you will find the trouble is his instead." "That will do, Mr. Grady," Jonas said. The two men did not shake hands. They only looked at each other, and something passed between them that was not friendship and was not forgiveness, but was something older and more useful than either. Halfway up the pass on the way home, Cyrus reined in his horse. "Jonas, about the story I told in Merton. I told it because I did not understand what I had seen. I have understood it now, and I have not known how to say so. You are saying so now. That is enough." The storm came on the morning of the 4th of February. Jonas felt it in the barometer before he saw it in the sky. The needle had begun to fall on the 2nd, slowly at first, and then faster on the 3rd, until by the morning of the 4th it had dropped further than his father's ledger had ever recorded in 29 years of entries. Jonas stood in the doorway of the cabin at first light and looked north, and he saw a wall of gray cloud rising above the mountains that was not a cloud at all but the leading edge of something much larger and much colder. He turned back into the cabin. "Martha." "It is coming." She did not ask what. She only nodded, and she began to move, checking the fuel pile, checking the flour barrel, checking the small store of dried apples and salt pork in the tin box beside the stove. Jonas checked the drain. He knelt at the edge of the southern sill and shone a lantern down through the inspection hatch, and he watched the warm water running steady and clear beneath the floor. He scraped the rim of the basin at the outcrop. He checked the stovepipe. He checked the seams around the door. Everything held. The storm arrived at noon. Within an hour, visibility had fallen to 50 feet. Within 3, the wind was strong enough that the canvas patch on the north gable began to hum against its battens, and Jonas went outside with a coil of rawhide and lashed it tighter. By nightfall, the temperature had fallen to 18 degrees below zero. Inside, the thermometer read 56. The first knock came some time after midnight. Willow heard it first. Jonas unlatched the door slowly and opened it just enough to see who was outside. It was Bertram Pell. Jonas did not hesitate. He pulled Bertram Pell into the cabin by the front of his frozen coat, and Martha was already there behind him, reaching for the woman and the 2 children who stood behind him in the storm. Bertram's wife Ellen knelt on the floor and began unwrapping the 2 small children, a boy of 4 and a girl of perhaps 2. The boy was crying. The girl was not, and Jonas understood at once that this was the more dangerous of the 2. Martha understood it too. She carried the little girl straight to the warm floor beside the north wall and began chafing her small hands between her own. Bertram swayed on his feet. "The roof beam split at the ridge," he said. "The snow load, we had not cleared it in 3 days. The stove was buried. I did not know where else to go, Hale." "You did right. Sit down by the wall." "The wall is warmer than the stove tonight." Bertram sat. He put his back against the north wall, and Jonas saw the first shudder of returning warmth pass through him. The second knock came an hour later. Cyrus Doone, riding through the storm on a horse covered in ice, had seen the Pell Farms lantern go dark. The third came near dawn, Reverend Ambrose Neal, whose parsonage stovepipe had failed, and his young sister. By first light on the 5th of February, there were 11 people inside the small cabin. 11 people. 1 mule in the lean-to, 1 shepherd on the floor by the north wall, and 1 small iron stove no bigger than a nail keg. The thermometer read -31 outside and 52 inside, and the walls held, and the floor held, and the warm steam rose steady through the narrow gaps between the boards. No one who had come in from the storm went back out again for 3 days. Sometime that first afternoon, Bertram raised his eyes at last. "Hale, I was wrong, in the fall, what I said." Jonas nodded slowly. "I know, drink your broth." That was all. The storm broke on the 7th of February. 14 people died in the county that week. None of them had been inside Jonas Hale's cabin. By March, the story had traveled to Cheyenne. By April, to Denver. In May, a man from the Union Pacific came up the trail and asked whether he might measure the cabin and draw its plans. Jonas said yes, provided the drawings were shared with any man who asked, and no patent was ever filed. Within 2 years, there were cabins built against warm outcrops, and rooms sealed with double walls and sawdust packing, and hearthstones set flat and wide, in every high valley from Montana to New Mexico. Jonas did not become a rich man. He had not built the cabin to become a rich man. He kept his father's ledger open on the shelf above the doorway, and he made his entries twice a day for the next 31 years. He scraped the basin every week. He cleaned the drain every month. He pulled up the floorboards every spring to check the joists. Ada grew up in the warm room by the north wall. Willow slept at the foot of her bed until the shepherd was 15 years old. Ellsworth Grady lived until 1904. Bertram Pell became one of the most respected sheepmen in the county, and he built a room onto his own house exactly the way Jonas had shown him. Jonas Hale died in the winter of 1921 in the same room he had built with his own hands. Ada, by then a schoolteacher in Sheridan, came home to sit with him at the end. She brought her youngest daughter, a small, serious girl of 7 with her grandmother's eyes, and the child slept on the warm floor beside her grandfather's bed on his last night. His last entry in the ledger, in a hand grown thin and slow, said only this: February 3, 1921. Outside -14, inside 53. The mountain still gives its breath. He closed the book. He set it on the shelf. He did not open it again. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share it with someone who needs to hear a story about patience and courage, and subscribe for more stories.